Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Welcome to the final instalment of our dialogue with Edi Bilimoria, author of the stunning 1200-page work Unfolding Consciousness. This is the second part of our dialogue exploring Book 3, entitled Gazing Through the Telescope, Man is the Measure of All Things. As with all the conversations in this series, we've done our best to make this audio friendly. However, I encourage you to watch this on YouTube if you can, or at least check out the diagrams in the video when you've listened to it. We start this final conversation with an exploration, beginning with Chapter 7 and the concepts of anthropogenesis and the way in which consciousness unfolds from the divine to the human. So Eddie, we went through the first parts of Book 3, which was all about the importance of symbols, and you express different levels of symbolism all the way up to the Hermetic axiom, the law of analogy, and then the cosmogenesis, the unfolding of consciousness. And we had a ride on cosmic planes and brought us back to terrestrial planes. I'd just like us now to go into Chapter 7, which is one on anthropogenesis, the unfolding of consciousness, divine self to human body. And I wonder if you could start with the term anthropogenesis, and what exactly do you mean by it, and what the methodology is that you've adopted to show how consciousness unfolds from the divine to the human.
Well, as with cosmogenesis, I explained it was really the birth and genesis and the origins of cosmos. So anthropogenesis, in the microcosm of the macrocosm, anthropogenesis is the origin and birth of man, of mankind, I should say. As always, starting from the divine level and seeing how that unfolds or overflows, to use our favorite term, how it overflows into actuality.
And in this chapter, you use a book called The Holy Science,
right?
And this is again just to demonstrate the perennial nature of the perennial philosophy, I think. Is that right?
Absolutely. Whether from the West or the East, from the East, Sankhya philosophy, emanating directly from the Vedas, of course, or the West, the Christian doctrines, all great seers and sages have accessed the one universal wisdom, and they have wrote about it or explained it in their own terms. So if we see through the allegory and understand their symbolism, we can see the absolute unity of their message. And Holy Science was written by Yukteswar, who was the master of Paramahans Yogananda, who wrote the famous, wonderful book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And the preface to Holy Science was written by Walter Evans Wentz, who was a very well-known, distinguished American anthropologist and a pioneer in the study of Tibetan Buddhism.
And even Isaac Newton makes another appearance as well.
Absolutely. Again, to make the point and demonstrate that the greatest minds, religious, philosophical, and scientific, from whatever corner of the globe, have spoken with one voice about the perennial philosophy. And we find how Sankhya philosophy here is corroborated not only by Christianity, but also what Newton says on expounding the only real substance in the universe, Sat in Sanskrit, God if you like, and why the man of the material world we were talking about, which eyes are looking through, why the man of the material world is unable to comprehend this refined divine substance, but how he may also comprehend it.
And is this the teachings around the causal body and the astral body, and they're relating to the physical? Is that what you were touching on there?
I'm touching on the non-physical, the non-visible, yeah. And you were saying about talking earlier about scientists of cutting off the bits that don't suit them. Well, let alone Newton's alchemy and theology, massive volumes. Every scientist or physicist worth talking about should have read Newton's Principia. And in there you have the general scholium, where Newton openly talks about the supreme God.
And so how do people explain that away?
About Newton and others?
Yes, about the general scholium being in his work and being central to his mathematical and scientific work.
Oh, they explain it away by, well, the first explanation was after writing Principia, he wrote the general scholium when he was a bit dotty. And when it was, yes, I mean, fancy calling Newton dotty. Seriously. And alchemy was just an aberration. But when it was so clearly shown that his alchemy and his theology was contemporaneous with Principia, that argument no longer holds. So then you sort of quietly ignore it, you see. You say something like, oh, well, that was the religion of that time, but we are now modern and we're not medieval anymore. So never mind that Newton said, he, the supreme God, is eternal and infinite. But and this is the point, as a blind man has no idea of colors, so have we no idea of the manner by which the all-wise God perceives and understands all things. He is utterly void of all body and bodily figure, and therefore can neither be seen nor heard nor touched. In other words, just because God is not corporeal doesn't mean we can't understand him. Or if God is not corporeal, let's ignore him.
Yes. Going through chapter 7, I found so much in there. I think we could get into it, but again, as with most of these chapters in your book, it would easily be a podcast or 2 or 3 on their own.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to.
Well,
but you mentioned the causal and the astral bodies, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the causal and the causal or the karmic body is the primary vehicle of consciousness of man's immortal component. Bearing in mind that any principle needs its vehicle of expression, the causal body, which is no body as such, but is so called, is the primary vehicle of man's highest nature. That's why it's called the karmic body. And the astral body, again, is the generic term for the non-physical, that is, the subtle bodies that contain the centers of operation for all the 5 senses and the organs of action.
And in the book as well, or in this chapter, you also talk about the difference between relative truth and real truth, between the appearance or Maya.
That is so important.
And of reality. And and reading, I read Holy Science as well as a result of this, and what he talks about with the senses and the creation of Maya. I found absolutely fascinating. So if there's any chance we can in this explanation of Maya and reality and just look at what it is and what it means for us today.
Well, there's that famous story of the great Chinese philosopher Huang Tzu, who recounts a vivid dream where he had one night where he dreamt he was a butterfly, but next morning when he woke up, he said to himself, I do not know whether I'm now a butterfly dreaming that I am a man, or whether I'm now a man dreaming that about a butterfly. So that blurring and distinction was something, that rather troubled him. And there's a similar story in Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland. Gurdjieff said, a rope in a dream is and is not. So Maya is loosely translated as illusion, but it's not that at all. It's the appearance of something much deeper than what it appears to be. So the distinction between absolute knowledge and relative knowledge, or between truth and real truth, no one could have expressed it better than the prince of relativity theory, Albert Einstein. What he said is, what may be true belongs to the realm of appearance. In other words, the realm of Maya. But what is really true deals with the realities behind the appearances. And then Einstein comes up with this seminal observation: we can only know the relative truth. We can only know the relative truth. The real truth is only known to the universal observer. Now, Einstein used the word universal observer, of course. He's not going to say God. But in the most simplistic sense, Jonathan, in the room you're sitting in, you cannot find out the full truth or the image of the whole room unless you explore it from every possible angle. You'd have to be a fly on the wall, a fly on the ceiling. You'd have to look at it from every possible angle. So what you see in your own room is only a relative vision. Only with total vision, with universal vision, would you pick up every dimension of the room you're in now.
And just say again what the Einstein's words for what you described as God.
We can only know the relative truth. The real truth is known only to the universal observer.
So I'm thinking of Einstein and the at that time and the rise of quantum
and relativity theory.
And the importance of the observer in quantum physics. And how the observer affects the observed.
Yes.
And there isn't, and so again, you can't separate one from the other because there's that interaction. There's a relationship that will be expressed through the actions of the whole. And so I just think that is just a wonderful description of such a profound truth, of a scientific truth. And so the idea of a universal observer is it's for us to discern the observer from the effects on the observed, right? On the effects on us. Well, fantastic.
And just coming back again, Jonathan, to what you were saying about scientists, most of them, Occam's razor, cutting off bits that don't suit them. If only scientists would read what their own type have written. What you've just said now, Max Planck said that we can never come to a total understanding without involving the human being, because we are part of what we are trying to understand. Exactly as you said. These great scientists have said it, but their lesser underlings have completely ignored their philosophical thought.
This is a monster chapter. That we've got it. It's just, I was laughing when I was going over, just looking at it now, and just how much there is in this chapter, how many layers there are to it. But you also, one thing I would like to draw out in this one is the work of Blavatsky, and the esoteric instructions and the inner group teachings. I just wonder, is there any way that we can touch on these areas and give insights to the listeners and viewers in a way that doesn't utterly overwhelm them with all the wisdom that's in that particular chapter?
The inner group teachings really elaborate, amplify, and to some extent correct her earlier instructions, not because the earlier ones were incorrect, but because what was given out in the inner group was too private and too sacred just to be disseminated, and could be so easily misunderstood. So again, what she has shown with more detail is how man has evolved by descent from spirit, not ascent from matter. And all things have their origins in spirit, and evolution has always begun from the above and worked downwards. And there is a wonderful diagram showing the macrocosm and the two microcosms, the divine consciousness, the archetypal, and the physical. Anything we make on Earth has the same process. If you want to design whatever, a new type of motor car, you have to have a vision. And then you have to have a blueprint. And then the blueprint must be converted into material and shape and form.
For people to appreciate, of the, it's like, well, the value of this is to recognize that you began as spirit, and you'll return to that.
Yes.
And so in that sense of rooting in that knowing of I am spirit, and I'm expressing myself, or spirit's expressing itself physically through my body. And then it's so what then, right? And it's like, well, then connect with the spirit and acknowledge that you're not, whilst you have your feet on the ground, that's not where you belong. And within this, then what we also bring in as well is in the next chapter you move into from the external sensation to the internal experience, and we're really coming in now, and these next chapters are the coming back to chapter 1 of book 1 of the importance of knowing yourself and the importance of experience, aren't we really? And I know it might seem like a long time ago for listeners, and it certainly feels that from a journey point of view, it certainly is. But I just wonder if we could look at the whole area in chapter 8 around the subjective perception of an objective universe. And yeah, would that be all right?
Yeah, of course.
And so you start with the Schrodinger mind sensation problem,
right?
Identifying specific issues and our impediments to understanding.
Yeah. Can I just briefly explain the Schrodinger mind sensation problem? That's my appellation, actually. Schrodinger, in his wonderful book, What is Life? And as I said earlier, these books are not hidden away in an archive. They're totally accessible. But scientists don't bother when it comes to philosophical thinking that's not physics, chemistry, material. And Schrodinger said, I'm paraphrasing, the scientific view is very deficient. Science can tell us in great detail how the waves of compression and rarefaction strike our eardrums, and then a neurological process goes to the brain. But why does an old song move us to tears? And I would say, why is it that when I listen to Muzak, I want to do that? That experience, as Schrodinger said, science is ghastly silent. His word, ghastly silent. But science often tries to explain these things, but they're so silly that we're not inclined to take them seriously. Explaining away, in other words. And then Schrodinger says, and what about the greatest questions we ask? Who am I? Where am I? Where am I going? Where is God? Science has no answer. So the mind sensation problem is Schrodinger hitting on the problem. How is it that I can hear a sound, but that sound brings tears to my eyes, even though it's airwaves? That is his conundrum. And mainstream science is completely obsessed with the idea that the brain produces consciousness or generates consciousness, which is why I call that a pseudoscience, that idea. So they're looking for a neurological or mechanistic explanation without ever questioning that the neurology and brain are instruments and not the producers of consciousness. And can I show you if I may, a very meaningful slide, again from the greatest scientist and philosopher. And I insist on saying that because people can't rubbish it then. So can you see this? Now, the great neurologist, Sir Francis Walsh, said that, of course, the soul needs a human person, or it needs some mechanism to collect its experience and distribute it, the distributing, integrating mechanism. But it's quite childish to identify the instrument with its user. And this, Jonathan, I've thought about it no end. This is the central cause of the confusion in science, identifying childishly the instrument with its user. So, as Peter Leggett said, Vice-Chancellor of Surrey University, Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, he puts it very simply. The pianist needs a piano, the performer needs an instrument, but you don't conflate the two, because if you do, as Brunton said, then the violin secretes music on its own, never mind the violinist.
So what you're establishing there, so Leggett's saying that we've got a pianist and the piano.
Yes.
And the mind corresponds to the pianist,
and
the brain to the piano. And if either pianist or piano are inadequate, so will be the music. If either mind or brain is inadequate, so will be the person. And Paul Brunton then goes on and says, if blood, bone and flesh of the human brain secrete thought, then the wood and strings of a violin secrete music, never mind the violinist.
I'm saying that's hence square brackets. And there's a lovely story of the great violinist Yosha Heifetz, who arrived in Tel Aviv, and the taxi driver said, "Oh, Mr. Heifetz, your violin produces such beautiful sounds." And Heifetz, I believe the story goes, he actually took his violin out and tapped it. Really? Does it produce lovely sounds? What about the violinist? You see, it's the same thing. All those years ago, in the last century, I put this slide up earlier, but it's so meaningful. William James identified 3 kinds of functional dependence on the brain: productive, releasing, transmissive. Productive in the sense that steam is produced by a kettle. Electricity is produced by the hydroelectric waterfall. Releasing is not producing, it is releasing, permissive. The crossbow releases the arrow, the crossbow doesn't produce it. And the third functional dependence is transmissive. And there he quotes the lovely couplet from Shelley, that life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. So there is this analogy between light and life. As a prism splits light, white light, into its colors, our brain, so to speak, splits what is essentially one radiance into all of these qualities that we identify with. So that being the case, my claim is not, in this chapter and the others, because I'm so clever at having discovered what a whole galaxy of scientists have not, but really that I've distilled the deepest wisdom from the legendary sages and philosophers who have understood and solved this problem, and I've really just put it together.
Just when we're looking at the meaning of Maya, because I know in the previous chapter when you were talking about the way in which Maya was seen as the hiding of the light of our spiritual nature or our spirit, and that to uncover or to get beyond Maya is to actually to return to the light, or to uncover that light. Is that correct?
I wouldn't so much call it hiding as mistaking its appearance for its true nature.
Hmm.
In that sense, hiding the true nature of it, yeah. But Maya is central. It's the creative force. I mean, we couldn't visualize or create something without Maya. It's the power of visualization, the power of coming into being. But then that spins a sort of web of glamour around us where we think that what we've spun, what we appear, what our appearances are, is what there really is and nothing more. But the question that mainstream science asks all the time, how does the brain generate consciousness? I would say, are they asking the right question? Because coming back to Einstein, he once said that if he had only 1 hour to solve a problem on which his whole life depended, he would spend 55 minutes asking the right question and then only 5 minutes solving it, answering it. So my answer to these scientists is that they're not asking the right question. When they say, how does the brain generate consciousness? This presupposes, in the first place, that the brain does, and they just don't know how. But does the brain generate consciousness? It doesn't, as I've shown you in those slides, and the one with William James. So there are 3 erroneous assumptions they make, and you did mention that earlier, if you'd like me just to touch on that. The 3 assumptions that are so completely erroneous is firstly, the relation between the senses and the mind, where neuroscience adamantly maintains that the senses, the physical senses, are the basic reality, and mind is a product of the senses and is therefore subordinate to the sense organs. Whereas in fact, it's completely the other way around. The mind works through the instrumentality of the brain and sense organs. And there is the lovely analogy with the queen bee and the other bees in the hive. The queen bee is the mind. The other bees that go out into the world are the body, brain, and senses that are subordinate to the mind. So that's the first one, the first assumption. The second erroneous assumption is a very limited outlook on the whole constitution of man, which, need I hardly say, as far as they're concerned, is only body, physical body. And they're completely resistant to blending physics with metaphysics, and so investigating the whole constitution of man, not just his physical counterpart. And the third one is the one that Sir Francis Walsh pointed out, the failure to distinguish consciousness from its vehicles, its bodies of expression. The assumption that the vehicle, the brain, is the mechanism considered to produce thought, rather like the violin produces music without the violinist.
Well, to carry on, the violin manifests the violinist to produce its own music. That's basically what we're saying. If we're saying that the brain generates consciousness, then the brain generates the violinist to play the violin.
I wouldn't say generates, it conditions consciousness, because if Edi Bilimoria or Heifetz were to play a cheap fiddle or a Stradivarius, the violin, i.e. brain, would certainly produce a different sound.
Sure.
It would condition the violinist.
Oh, but it constrains it or frees it. But I'm saying if I was following the idea that the brain produces consciousness, then if we have the analogy of the violin and the violinist,
Yeah.
And it's the violin creates a violinist to play it, which is absolutely, I mean,
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes.
and so
Yeah.
it begins, not only do we have the, the violinist, but it's also just using, okay, so, and also I guess, the question for ourselves would be, what's the quality of my brain? Am I a 10-pound fiddle, or am I is my brain and my mind and my body a Stradivarius?
I've got a lovely quotation on that very one. That mortal man is the physical instrument, and his thoughts and ideas are played through his mind and body. But whether we are a cheap cracked fiddle or a Stradivarius, there is still the Paganini who stands behind us.
Yeah, beautiful. Is there anything that we can touch on in chapter 8 that we haven't already? I mean, there's again just so many things. We haven't mentioned vitalism and nerve ether. We haven't measured the cosmic elements. I'd spoken about those, and the 3 mental currents that exist in each person.
Well, the 3 mental currents, that's a shorter one. The first is really the entirely subjective activity of one's own mind, as in fantasy or daydreaming, without any contact with the external world. The second, most common one, is the projection of mental images from one mind to another, as in thought transference and telepathy. The third one is the activity of divine mind on individual mind, whether through the instrumentality of the senses or in profound meditation.
Yes. And with this then moves us into then a deeper exploration of divine forces in the human being. And in this one is excitingly titled The Awakening of Latent Faculties and Powers of Consciousness. So I guess again, just as we're manifesting the spirit into the physical,
yes,
and just exploring that, how should we start?
Well, the 3 always starting from as below, so above. Again, in order to make anything, we first need the raw material, then we need to shape it and give it a form, and then to inhabit it. So to build a house, we need the bricks and mortar, but bricks and mortar are not a house. We got to have a plan and shape it. But then it's only a house. It becomes a home when you move into it. So the 3 divine forces, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesha, are to do with just those 3 aspects of creation, creating the raw material, the evolution of the vehicles, and the expression of reality. And you can certainly relate that to the Christian Trinity, though I'm sure a lot of Christians wouldn't like that.
When you quote in Holy Science, and what comes out in that book is just the extraordinary nature, the rereading of the Bible,
right?
Absolutely mind-blowing of linking it to other ancient insights and wisdom. So we've got
the for the 3 divine forces, the collective word is the Logos, of course, which is Ishvara in Sanskrit, or the manifested deity. The manifested deity, known as Ishvara, is the outward expression or effect of the cause which is ever concealed.
What's the role then of divine forces in the makeup of the human being?
The role of the divine forces is so that you can live and exist. So take the human being. As a baby, if you cut your finger, it's very well known, children heal very fast. The creative force is very much to the fore, but the regenerative, the destructive, which is not the right word, but the ending, the destructive force of Shiva is also present. Otherwise, that child would never ultimately die. There is also that which preserves life, and the 3 forces are mostly in balance around middle age. Towards the end of your life, even on your last day, I would maintain if you cut yourself, there's going to be some healing, but the creative force of Brahma, which was so prevalent as a baby, is virtually extinct, but not entirely. But the regenerative, destructive force of Shiva is now in the ascendant, so that you may be taken away physically and regenerate. So all of those three forces are always operating, but in different proportions at different stages. It's well known that when you break your bones, your hair stops growing, your nails stop growing, because the great wisdom of the body knows where to put its vitality. The hair is not so important.
Yeah, and when you become stressed, then
things
can start to fall off, right? Nails can even, hair falls out. It goes even further than, just in a way of the system protecting itself, of focusing on the most important survival aspects.
Yeah. So one of those three divine forces has gained the ascendancy.
Yes.
Depending on the situation, but all three are always there. On vitalism, I think there is that wonderful quote by the French Nobel physicist showing what is there in the blood that is simply cannot be produced by ordinary chemicals and physics and chemistry. In other words, life is more than just chemistry. And Alexis Carrel, the French surgeon and biologist awarded the Nobel Prize, he compared the amount of liquid needed to keep artificially alive a certain amount of live tissue, compared with the amount of blood you'd need to keep that live tissue and eliminate the waste products. And he said that if all the tissues of the human body were treated in this way, it would take 45,000 gallons of circulating fluid to keep these tissues alive from being poisoned in a few days by their own waste products. Within the living organism, the human body, the blood achieves the same task with 1.5 gallons. What's that telling us? Astrologically, blood, iron, planet Mars, prana, sun, they all come together in a whole body of wisdom connected with the human being, and much more, of course.
Now, I mean, you mentioned vitalism there, and it is still a controversial topic, right? Could you just explain to the listeners, if they haven't, what vitalism is, what the criticisms have been of it from the people as eminent as Francis Crick?
Francis Crick.
But also, so what is it? Why is it being criticised? But why do you regard vitalism as being so important?
Because it presents an organizing field. Francis Crick, he is, I think, quoted as saying that in his paper with Watson and Wilkins, the other two are hardly ever mentioned. He now feels that he has discovered the structure of DNA, which has delivered a blow to vitalism. Life is just chemistry. But vitalism, for me, is an older statement of Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic field. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but we're talking of an organizing field as a template. And that is part of the nervous organization, which the great scientist Richardson, he called the vital principle, which he called the nervous ether, with its fountainhead in the sun. And again, I come back to the great Newton. At the end of the General Scholium, he talks about a certain most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hidden in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which all sensation is excited, and the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will. So this nervous ether, vitalism, all generic terms for this subtle spirit, so to speak, this subtle fluid, gas, that pervades the nervous system and is responsible for its power to act on will.
Do you know, I just had a thought there, Eddie, just about so in economics, for example, we've got a lot of problems, and there's a, if you actually, our assertion is with its Shepheard-Walwyn is that actually there are organizing principles that were neglected. So, for example, Adam Smith, probably the most influential English-speaking economist, some of his stuff is still used, but it's without the more important work of his theory of moral sentiment.
Yes.
And the way in which you describe the organizing principles of that is it. So, for example, if you and I both act in our own best interest, right, we just pursue our own interest, which is a fundamental tenet of modern economic theory. But it's now stripped of the organizing principle that I am in sympathy with you and you are in sympathy with me, meaning that you're not going to do something that would harm me, because that would morally that would hurt you, because you couldn't stand that, because we're in a community. And that was the fundamental principle that Smith based his economic philosophy. That was the economics was a step down from the theory of moral sentiments. And yet we're missing that organizing principle. It means that then we've just got agents running around doing their own thing and damaging others. And it's because there isn't the organizing principle to the whole. And it just seemed that seemed analogous to what you were saying there.
That's a very good example, not just an analogy, an example from economics. It would be a bit like being in a traffic jam and we all do our own thing and bang into each other to get ahead. Whereas if we considered the whole, the organizing whole, if we all drove with consideration, the whole system would improve. And if the system improves, we must, because we are part of it.
Yeah, we mentioned about consciousness and the brain and everything else, and one of the modern manifestations of that, especially with Imperial College, is the use of psychedelics to raise consciousness. And yet you warn us about the dangers of potentially resorting to.
It's the most foolish thing one can do.
What are your overall feelings about using drugs to elevate consciousness?
Right. I would say, firstly, anything where you achieve any elevation, you do through your own, you deserve it through your own effort. I don't mean ego. If a drug elevates consciousness, let's look at it this way. If I burst into a bank, well, you don't do that now, it's cyber attacks anyway. If I burst into a bank and rob 1 million, I've not gained 1 million. I would love to play the piano at the Royal Festival Hall. That would be an absolute dream to give a recital. I'm not qualified. I could, when someone's playing, throw him off the stool and sit on the piano and play. Am I playing in the Royal Festival Hall or am I not? So I've not deserved it. So the ultimate of spiritual evolution, of elevating consciousness, to think you can take a drug and raise a consciousness is, as far as I'm concerned, a complete oxymoron. Now, the reason is this. It's far more than just a philosophical talk. The action of drugs is to displace the body from its etheric and astral counterparts. And therefore it renders us open and prey to all sorts of unseen and multitudinous influences, which is why people have a good trip or a bad trip. You're exposing yourself to the elementals, and more often than not, a harmful elemental. the action of the drug is to loosen or tear holes in the etheric web, the protection of the etheric double that inhibits these harmful influences entering our physical body. So taking drugs, Mexican mushrooms, hashish or LSD, will or may give you glimpses, may give you signs or give you hints, but ultimately the interior deterioration is absolutely guaranteed. And I don't mean drugs for strictly medical psychiatric purposes. That's quite different. There is this, Jonathan, this idea, I can get what I like when I want it for as little cost, and I want it now. Drugs, let's do it. And there's no thinking about, do I deserve it? Have I earned it? Am I qualified? Am I mentally robust? Is my emotional nature centered?
But Eddie, so there's some things there from a performance point of view, right? Let's just say I was coaching you, and you said, John, one of my life's ambitions is to play at the Royal Festival Hall, and let's just say I had a friend who was doing a concert there, and I said, okay, Eddie, so one of the things I want you to do, I want you to be utterly inspired by that vision, and I want you to experience it. And so we could use imagination as a way of doing that. You're visualizing yourself at the Royal Festival Hall. But what I could then also do is say, look, I can get you backstage. So we can go backstage and we're going to watch my friend play on the stage. And I want you to stand in the wings and imagine you're about to walk on stage and feel everything, all the excitement you're hearing, the audience is settling and you're prepared. And I want you to feel that, right? And then so we do that, right? Can you imagine that?
Easily.
Right.
And sorry to interrupt. You've used a very important word, imagine. That is the power of Maya.
Right. Okay. So we're still backstage, right? And then the curtain opens and we see, and my friend plays, and you're inspired by that. And then my friend on stage says, "Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I have a new friend backstage, and he just wants to." He's preparing to play at the Royal Festival Hall, and I know it can be nerve-wracking to do that. Would you be okay if he played a couple of minutes right now? And so he invites you on stage, and then you do a 2 or 3 minute recital just to experience it, right? And the crowd are very, oh, Eddie, that's very good, very good. Please keep going because we'd like to see your concert, right? So that in and of itself, I would say, so you've not knocked my friend off the stool.
No.
You've been invited on stage. And so you've done it within the context, and the audience are okay with that and everything else. So I just wonder what would be wrong in and of that experience.
Nothing at all. But I wouldn't be invited by the concert agents to give a 2-hour recital.
Well, no. So then the question then is, so that for me is, okay, Eddie, what now? So you come off stage. And it's like, Eddie, how was that? What was that experience like? You were in front of 2,000 people. Are you now more inspired to find your way back there yourself?
Right. I know where you're getting at. Yes, I would say that would be the best single use of a drug. It's given you that taste. It's given you that glimpse. But your friend backstage is not going to be doing that every day of his life. He's going to be saying, now you study, now you practice 6 hours a day. I've given you a taste and you deserved it because you were so keen. But now you get on with it.
Yes, and do the work and find your own way back, right? And I think that's and totally get the idea of using these things, because the thing that really stands out for me there is when you were talking about being open to negative forces and the danger of a bad trip if people do these things unsupervised and unsupported, which I think is what I really like about the psychedelic research, which is very ecological in terms of safety, to the extent of holding back the experience, right? Of being unnecessarily safe. in inverted commas.
Mm.
And the importance of being in, so the importance of having others with you and making sure that you stay safe.
Having a support structure,
Yes.
which is so important, not just doing it as a DIY.
Yeah, and to not confuse the taste of with you being a Royal Festival Hall pianist, because it was kind of like, if you remember, I mean, that Make-A-Wish Foundation stuff, and it's like, well, a wish has come true, but it's not true because it isn't real in a sense. You've not made it real. You've not manifested it in the world. So we've talked about the dangers of taking a shortcut towards the awakening of latent faculties, such as the inappropriate use of psychedelics. What ecological ways would you encourage for someone to awaken latent faculties, Eddie?
Right. There are wonderful safe methods recommended by modern sages. The meditations on the mystery of the breath, the heart, and the eye, and all of that, of course, underpinned by constant self-inquiry and mental discipline.
You also talk about the real faculty of intuition and what that really is, which I thought was a really wonderful. It's only brief, but and you quote one author of intuition gives us the idea of the whole and the intellect analysis of parts. And I'm just wondering if there's anything else you can share with the viewers on got controlled use of psychedelics. You also, I mean, you talk about Steiner and Goethe's warnings about the dangers of premature entrance into the higher worlds, and to use our analogy of the Royal Festival Hall, it could be that you find your way on and it goes badly on stage.
Yeah, and you're a bag of nerves and you make a fool of yourself.
And you get booed off, and it's like, bloody Edi Bilimoria, we're not going to go see him again.
No. But talking of intuition, I mentioned Isaac Newton and Srinivasan Ramanujan as supreme examples of being completely self-taught, autodidactic. Very different cultures, very different religious faiths, but that is secondary. They were both very deeply religious and universal in their outlook. And neither of them came from a particularly intellectual or mathematically inclined family. It doesn't mean the family wasn't intelligent, but it wasn't educated in that sense. So intuition is tuition from within, self-taught, autodidactic. You said I was having a go at Darwin. No, it's more the Darwin's poodles, so to speak. One of Darwin's famous sayings needs to be taken more seriously, which is, we have more confidence in our ignorance than in what we know. So in other words, he said ignorance begets more confidence than our knowledge. Darwin was good medicine for the religious superstition of his day. But modern evolutionary science only looks at evolution purely from the standpoint of biological evolution. And they only look at the changing of form. They're not aware of the indwelling consciousness or the impulse behind that change of form. So evolution means a turning outward. It doesn't mean piling one brick on top of another. It's really an opening up of innate faculties. And involution is the reverse process, a rolling inwards, and the two always go together. So when matter evolves, it is turning out its spiritual possibilities. When spirit involves, it gets more and more congealed in itself. It involves. And then there's also the word devolution, which is dropping from one height to a lower height.
You mentioned evolution of kingdoms of nature.
Yes.
and you provide some quotes from the East and the West in that.
Yes.
What are you driving at there in that part of the book?
What I'm driving at as the whole of nature always wants to march to a higher stage of itself, coming ever closer and closer to its ultimate purpose and its origins. So, which is why the stone dies in order to become a plant, which dies in order to become an animal, similarly to become a human, and then to become superhuman. So there is always this ongoing march. Nothing is ever static.
And so if we appear to be going backwards, then we've got something wrong, I guess.
Unless we go backwards to go upwards, so to speak. Yes, definitely, yes. We are regressing if we're going backwards, yeah.
But I don't know if we're focusing too much on a theory that was useful, as you said, Darwin's approach
It was very useful,
and
yes.
Wallace's stuff as well was extremely useful at the time, and yet there's a lot of people around those theories that hold them in place.
Right.
What would, and you talk in the chapter about some of the legitimate criticisms of the poodles, of Darwin's, of what people have, not the theory itself, but the way in which it's not taken on and taken into account new discoveries.
They've converted a theory into an ideology. And the criticisms come from people like Thomas Nagel, professor at New York University, Amit Goswami, Oregon, Brian Goodwin, who said that evolution on its own is far too weak a force. And most of all, from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a great champion of Darwin, but saw its limitations. He said that the explosion of mathematical knowledge can't be explained purely on the basis of natural selection. So that's a part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And so the real principle of evolution, as understood in occult science, is to show that all life is in various stages of becoming, being and becoming.
And you end this chapter with the state of enlightenment and the quality of genius.
It's interesting, Jonathan, how scientists grapple with this whole idea of trying to avoid divinity. And it's either blind chance, absolute blind chance, well, forget that. Then there's this stupid 1,000 monkey or million monkey syndrome. But I say, even if a million monkeys could type even a word of Shakespeare, let alone all the sonnets, they would not be typing Shakespeare. They would only be typing words. So if in a state of drunken stupor I typed TOBENOTTOBE, I would not understand to be or not to be. I would just be typing words. So even the stupid million monkey or whatever, infant monkey syndrome, would only be typing words, not the thought and the consciousness behind it. The most promising is the multiverse, as I mentioned, and the fourth is the anthropic principle, all of which, both of those are nudging science quite significantly towards the perennial philosophy, as indeed quantum physics has done, which is the greatest contribution of science to the perennial philosophy. So it's not, as Erwin Laszlo said, it's not evolution or design. It's design for evolution.
Are there any parts of occult science that they provide to this jigsaw of scientific insights that you'd like to touch on, that science just hasn't fathomed in it, or overall the collective science hasn't fathomed, even if individual scientists have?
On evolution, well, the secret doctrine goes into it in great depth, but it's a massive, massive thing to chew. The most useful is the one, Creative Evolution, by Amit Goswami, where he talks a physicist's resolution between Darwinism and intelligent design, and he talks very eloquently about the whole field of quantum physics and consciousness. That would be a very good entree.
The title of the final chapter of the book is Summary of the Theme, Consciousness is an Element.
And why is it an element? Because an element is something that is completely irreducible. As in physical chemistry, we have the elements. Ultimately, consciousness is irreducible.
And it's from that everything else is built, from the elements that
Or
everything's
emanated.
built.
Yeah.
Great. So you say in this book that having based on this, and you talk about the Janus or the Janus faces of science.
Yes.
What do you mean by that, and where are the two faces pointing?
Well, the dark Janus face, there's no shortage of examples of that. One can think of the whole question of transhumanism, trying to use genetic material and microchips and stuff like that to enhance immortality as they see it. The other one, recent one, is the Neuralink organization founded, I think, by Elon Musk, to experiment first on monkeys, implanting chips in their brains, and to see how that can enhance and supposedly provide some insight into the human brain operates. Ghastly experiments on animals, all in the name of science, but really to satisfy the egos of scientists. And genetically modifying materials and fooling around with the basic stuff of our physical existence with little understanding of the consequences. There's also absolutely wonderful stuff, of course. The dark Janus face is pointing that way, and the bright face is pointing upwards. It's showing us near-death experiences, for example, showing the continuity of consciousness, universal mind, morphogenetic fields. And Brian Josephson, who came up with this incredible insight that physics needs agents, as he put it, and agents are the cause of physics. Now, what does he mean by agents? I'm suggesting he's alluding to the non-physical energy entities, which I call the elementals, who are all part and parcel of nature's laboratory.
Mm. It's something that's becoming more and more important in psychology and in performance, and the importance of agency.
Yes.
And of recognizing it's recognizing yourself as an agent in the situation, and if you're not, then to find ways to become a more powerful agent, so that you can start to shape things. I mean, chapter 11, it could almost be, if you could extend that a little bit, and it would be a book in and of itself, wouldn't it, really? And so we're summarizing, we're looking at the challenge of the material, which was the first part of book one. We're looking at but also looking at the positive aspects of science,
yes, most certainly,
and its contribution, but also framing it and recognizing its limitations of what it can and can't do.
Yep.
And that it isn't a limitation of science to have limitations. It's just the nature of science to have limitations in that area.
Yeah.
And then we're moving into the whole area around the importance of the spiritual and.
But I've also emphasized the spiritual has a dark face as well, in no uncertain terms.
Go on.
The glamour, the false prophets, the obsession with having starry-eyed disciples sitting around you, wanting power and control, all of that. That's also a great casualty.
I guess again, it's like the spiritual master who who surrenders the value of their own experience for the experience of being a guru.
Yes.
And they just stop producing or stop contributing anything, right? Because they're no longer connected to the wisdom that got them to the position of guru.
Yes.
It's whether that was a result of psychedelics or just the unearned rewards that they get. I know I've got friends who, Eastern friends tend to hold gurus in a safer regard than Westerners.
They do. Because
Westerners, they can surrender everything, but there's always an element of independence in the Eastern approach to a guru that I found, and when we're interacting with people. So, Eddie, what summary can we make when you're looking at your whole work as typified and exemplified in this amazing chapter of consciousness as an element? What are the conclusions that you'd like to draw together to summarize the 3 books that's present in the final chapter?
I would say, firstly, it is so important always to hold a balance between intellect and devotion. Always to keep those two going. Obviously, some subjects will need more one than the other, but you mentioned the guru and the Eastern approach. Devotion is wonderful, but it can soon turn into hero worship. It can soon turn into sheer gullibility and delusion. To counter that, you need a sharp intellect to pare away all the dross and to bring you back to balance. Now, the intellect on its own, don't we know, the arrogance, the self-importance, wanting control, that can be mitigated to a great extent by the humility that comes from the devotional approach. So depending on your own internal nature, one or other will predominate. And if you're a man of action, you'll be a man of action. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita, there are the 3 great yogas, the yoga of the mind, the yoga of the heart, and the yoga of action, bhakti, jnana, and karma. So that's one thing I'd say, but it's most important, I think, always to remember that our evolutionary journey can't be defined, but we can describe it any more than we can define a journey. We can experience it. And our body is the path, so to speak, we travel on, and consciousness is the traveler on that never-ending journey of evolution. But the greatest discovery of all for me is not the outer one of going to new galaxies and is there life on Mars, was there water on Venus, all that. That's easy in a sense. The greatest discovery for me is the inner journey to discover who we truly are. And that's the most difficult, but yet the most important of all discoveries.
I guess what you're saying there is for us to reconnect with the universal observer.
Yeah.
Yes. And by going inwards, recognizing the vision or the illusion in front of us, we can focus on what's true through our experience, and that then leads us back to the internal, the divinity of which we're a part and an expression.
Yeah. Of which we're a part, and therefore, when we know that, we know everyone else, because they are a part.
Yeah.
And this ghastly thing that's going on in the world, where people are focused on my country, my this, my that, the consciousness is so isolated and so sectarian, without any thought that we belong to one earth and one planet. See, at the heart of every atom, of every universe, there is spirit, which is completely deathless and divine. And any system or any person that denies that will ultimately never last. Whether it's an individual or whether it's an atheistic system or a communist system that denies the inner divinity. It must fall ultimately.
But and Eddie, on this, I just wonder if we could finish with the destiny, meaning, and purpose.
Where I've quoted the thing from Beethoven's Last Quartet.
Yes, so wondrously. I just wonder if you could share with the listeners on what you say about how destiny, meaning, and purpose applies to the unfolding of consciousness.
The destiny is meaning and purpose. They're all to discover who we truly are. If we think of a sportsman, first he had a wonderful, supple, muscular body, and he enjoyed his time in sport. Then when he grows old to the age of 100, he can't run around like that. He has to cast off his outworn body and take on new vehicles, so that his lifelong love, his destiny, can express through new vehicles of consciousness. So meaning, purpose, and destiny are all part and parcel of the same movement of consciousness towards its ultimate goal, which really was its origin. So as we cast off our physical clothes, as we cast off our outworn bodies, we seek new bodies to fulfill that inner drive.
You look at the way in which that idea is now being turned into physical aspects of striving for physical immortality, or computerized immortality, is to miss the whole point.
It is missing the whole point, and I think it is absolutely hideous, because vast amounts of money are being spent. It's going on now as we speak. Preserving people in liquid nitrogen is a strong movement. There is a fellow at Oxford University. When a fellow, I don't mean a bloke, I mean a fellow of Oxford College, openly promulgating this idea of transhumanism, fixated on this idea of physical immortality. But let me put it this way, that with all this darkness and blindness, there has to be a hidden purpose behind that. Nature always has a hidden purpose, and that hidden purpose is to find the hidden purpose in all things. So as Khalil Gibran put it so beautifully, that the veil that covers your eyes and the clay that blocks your ears, ultimately the veil will have to be torn by the same hands that wove it, and the clay that blocks your ears will have to be unblocked by the same hands that kneaded the clay. But in that moment, you will not curse the darkness or the deafness, because how would you know? You would not deplore it, because then when you finally hear and see, you will know the hidden purpose in all things, and then you would bless the darkness as you would bless the light.
Yes, and it brings us again. Just the whole purpose of all the work is to return home, isn't it? And to return to our original state.
Yes, absolutely. To return to our home, because
Eddie,
we are homesick.
Eddie, this is yes, and I can certainly relate to that. Eddie, you've produced a truly remarkable work. I am leaving questions unanswered, but I think that the listeners, I think what we've got to do is encourage listeners to get the books, read them, and then we all meet again in a year or so when they've read and digested the books, and we can talk again on just applying. Because of all the works I'm lucky enough to speak with the authors about, I think your work has changed me the most.
That's very kind, Johnson.
It's truly extraordinary, and in ways, Eddie, as well, that are only just unfolding. And so I will remember. I am remembering that this isn't This is a verb. Your book is a verb. It is not a noun. And, just going through the book again in our conversation, thinking, oh my goodness, there was this and there's that, and there's the suppressed archaeological evidence of Vedic doctrine, and we've got amazing diagrams linking Blavatsky with ancient work and the holy science, and so just amazing stuff, Eddie. So on behalf of Shepheard-Walwyn and also of myself, thank you for the decades of work that you've done to be expressed in these series of books.
Jonathan, I'm very humbled with your words. Thank you so much. And I'm deeply grateful to Shepheard-Walwyn and everyone who helped to make this come to be, because I've said on quite a few occasions that there were some amazing synchronicities that all had to happen for these 4 volumes to be produced. And I don't think it was coincidence. I think it was the right time. So I'm very deeply grateful to Shepheard-Walwyn for providing the vehicle in terms of the divine forces so that the impulse could manifest in the physical world.
Thank you for joining us on this series of conversations with Edi Bilimoria to celebrate and to introduce his masterpiece, Unfolding Consciousness. Now, I hope as a Shepheard-Walwyn podcast listener, you'll agree that as a publisher, we're committed to encouraging different voices and perspectives, whether that's in the economic realm with Phil Anderson and Fred Harrison, and John Butler in spiritual practice. And it's our conviction that Eddie's work, as I hope you've experienced in this series, has the potential to change the dialogue in so many areas. Most significantly, perhaps, in the interaction between science and spirituality, and a reappraisal and reintroduction of our ancient wisdom traditions, the perennial philosophy, into our discourse on how to add meaning to our existence. And if you've listened to this series of conversations with Eddie, then I hope you feel ready to make the investment in his magnus opus. It's taken 6 months to complete these recordings, and I think I'm on the 3rd or 4th reading of each of the books, and I still feel like I'm reading them for the first time, as there's so much new wisdom to consider on each successive reading. And my conviction is that even if you have much more awareness with the perennial philosophy than I have, you'll have a similar experience of newness. So for the last time with Eddie at least, thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. Be sure to connect with us at shepheardwalwyn.com and join our mailing list for updates and special offers. And if you feel it's appropriate, give us a like wherever you get your podcasts and also on YouTube. It's surprisingly helpful for getting the message out. So until next time, keep reading.